On the surface, managing a country's economy sounds, well, maybe not simple, but at least straightforward. But what happens when you throw open the doors and connect that economy to the entire planet? Well, suddenly, the game changes completely.
It kind of begs the question, right? Why can't a government just, fix its own problems? What is it about these global forces that throws such a wrench in the works? All right, let's dive in and really break this down.
Okay, so before we can really get into the weeds of the challenge, we have to be super clear on the goal. I mean, what is every nation actually trying to accomplish with its economy?
You see, at the heart of it all, every government is chasing this thing economists call internal balance. And it sounds simple enough, right? It just means you want pretty much everyone who wants a job to have one, and you want prices to be stable and predictable. Basically, low unemployment, low inflation. I mean, that's the holy grail.
And yeah, for just about any modern economy, that is the absolute goal. But here's the thing, and the source material really hammers this home. Getting there is anything but simple. It's this incredibly delicate balancing act. So, to really wrap our heads around just how complex this gets, let's do the opposite. Let's simplify. Let's imagine an economy that's completely cut off from the rest of the world, like it's playing in its own little sandbox. What kind of tools would its government have in there? Well, they basically got two main levers to pull. First, you've got fiscal policy. Think of this as the government's wallet. It's all about how much it decides to spend and how much it collects in taxes. And then you have monetary policy. This is the central bank's territory. They're the ones in charge of the money supply and setting interest rates.
So let's stick with our little sandbox economy for a minute. How does that fiscal policy lever actually work? It's actually pretty straightforward. If you're in a recession, the government can either spend more money, say on infrastructure, or it can cut taxes. Either way, more money ends up in people's pockets, they go out and buy more things, and boom, the economy starts to grow.
And what about monetary policy? Well, it's pretty much the same simple logic. The central bank can flood the system with more money, which pushes interest rates down. Suddenly, it's cheaper for you to get a loan for a car, or for a business to get a loan to expand. They spend and invest more, and just like before, the economy gets a nice little boost. Sounds easy, doesn't it?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. What happens when we open up that sandbox and let our little economy play with the rest of the world? I'll tell you what happens. The entire rulebook gets thrown out the window.
Because when you open up, you introduce these massive new forces into the equation. All of a sudden, you've got to think about international trade, what you're selling to other countries and what you're buying from them. You've got these huge waves of global capital. We're talking about money just zipping across borders 24/7, looking for the best possible return. And then you've got the big one, the exchange rate, how much your currency is worth compared to everyone else's.
And this really gets to the heart of the new reality. There's a great line in the source material that says, with an open economy, the nation finds that the success of these policies depends on factors such as the international mobility of financial capital and the flexibility of its exchange rate. What that really means is that those simple tools we talked about, they now have all these knock-on effects and consequences you never even had to think about in your little sandbox.
So this naturally leads us to what is maybe the single most important decision a country has to make in this globalized world: what to do about its currency. This is what we call the exchange rate dilemma.
And really, it boils down to two main paths. You can go with a fixed rate. This is where you basically anchor your currency's value to another one, like the US dollar. Or you can go with a floating rate, where you just let the free market decide. The value of your currency just goes up and down based on global supply and demand.
Okay, so here's the million-dollar question. How does this one, single choice, fixed or floating, totally flip the script on how that economic toolkit of ours actually works?
All right, let's play this out. Let's take a country that's chosen a fixed exchange rate, and let's say they're in a bit of a slump, so they use fiscal policy. They ramp up government spending to get things going again. So far, so good. The first thing that happens is exactly what they want. The economy gets a nice little kickstart. But wait, there's more. Here comes the second round effect. All that government spending starts to push up interest rates. Now, foreign investors see this and they think, hey, I can get a better return there. So they start flooding in, buying up the local currency. This demand makes the currency want to get stronger, what economists call appreciate. But remember, the country has a fixed exchange rate. So to stop it from rising, the central bank has to step in. It prints more of its own currency and sells it to meet that demand. And what does that do? It pumps even more money into the economy, giving it a second boost.
So what's the bottom line? Fiscal policy in this system becomes incredibly powerful. It's like
It's on steroids. The very act of defending the fixed exchange rate actually doubles down on the original plan, making it way more effective.
Okay, but now for the flip side. What happens if that same country tries to use monetary policy? The central bank says, let's cut interest rates to get people borrowing and spending. And just like before, the initial effect is what you'd expect. It helps a little bit. But, and this is a huge but, there's a problem. Those super low interest rates, they make holding that currency a bad deal for investors. So what happens? Money starts flowing out of the country. This makes the currency want to get weaker or depreciate. And again, because they're committed to a fixed rate, the central bank has to intervene to prop it up. But this time they have to buy their own currency, which pulls money out of the economy, shrinking the money supply. They're literally working against their own goal.
The end result? Monetary policy is basically useless here. It's totally weakened because everything the central bank has to do to defend the currency completely cancels out what it was trying to do in the first place.
So this is the big reveal. You can think of this as the ultimate cheat sheet for how to run an economy in a globalized world. It's pretty amazing when you look at it. Under a fixed exchange rate, like we just saw, fiscal policy is your powerhouse, and monetary policy is weak. But if you have a floating rate, it's the complete opposite. Monetary policy becomes super effective, and fiscal policy gets weaker. That one decision, fixed versus floating, it just changes everything.
Okay, so let's zoom out for a second. If one country's choices can cause all these ripples, imagine what happens when all the big economies are making moves at the same time. It raises a huge question. Can and should nations actually try to work together to coordinate all of this?
You know, we actually have a perfect real-world example of this from the 1980s. The US dollar was on an absolute tear. It was so strong that it was crushing American companies trying to sell their stuff overseas. So in 1985, the world's biggest economies got together for what's called the Plaza Accord, and they all agreed to act together to bring the dollar's value down. And it worked. In fact, it worked a little too well. So just 2 years later, they met again for the Louvre Accord to coordinate and stop the dollar from falling too far. It's just a fantastic case study that shows, yes, sometimes cooperation can actually work.
And all of this brings us to a really critical question for right now, one that's pulled straight from the source material. When you look at this incredibly complex dance between a country's own goals and all these powerful global forces, does a government really have enough firepower left in its toolkit to fight off the next big economic storm? It's not a theoretical question. It's something that leaders and central bankers all over the world are trying to figure out as we speak.